All right, is that better? Hey, we got
Hey,
we got audio. All right.
sorry, we were talking a while ago, and it's probably what y'all hear all the time. You like to see our faces and our mouths move, but you don't catch
Don't
a
want to
thing
hear
we
this.
said.
Amber, nice of you to join us. As I was saying, with no audio. Um, be sure to like and share the podcast if you're watching. Make a comment just to say hey. It helps us with the algorithms. But what we're going to be talking about today is false prophets. We talked about it some already. I mean, what
Yeah.
what to do about false teachers. I'm gonna do a shameless plug of a book that I get no royalties from. But I think everybody should listen to it. Or read it. I listen to books. I actually have listened to it 3 times this week.
Mm.
Just because it was beneficial and I needed to hear it. Um, but for the people out there, how was your vacation?
Oh,
They
vacation was
missed that
good.
part.
Yeah, so I have two sons in the Marine Corps. However many of you knew that, and they're both new. So one is in school in uh, Little Creek, Virginia, and the other one's at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. So for Juneteenth, they had a long weekend. You know, Juneteenth just turned into a holiday
Yep.
or a federal holiday last year, I think.
It's also my birthday.
And it's well, Juneteenth is a much more celebrated fact than your
Yes.
birthday is. So anyway, we went out, drove out to see them, and we took a couple extra days for ourselves on the way back, and we just got back 2 days ago.
Well,
So here we are.
and we missed last week. Because I was by myself, but I had to work. I just had a bunch of work I had to get done. So we're glad to be back. Um, in Second Peter, we talked about it 2 weeks ago. I was here, just me. And we talked about false teachers and what we're going to do. What's going to happen? I mean, it's
Yeah,
like one of the themes. If you've been following our podcast that Tim and I talk about all the time, is it's just the nature of man when we start to see what it is that God's doing or going to do, or even if we have a promise of something He's going to do, we we want to help Him. We want to help Him do what's right, and
well, what's
what,
worse
what
is
we understand is right.
I can understand that. Actually, call it righteous zeal, whatever you want to call it. Uh, it's not an excuse not to do the right thing, but I can actually understand that. So
Right,
Paul would have had righteous zeal when he was standing there watching Stephen getting killed, right?
right,
Uh, and uh, but it's when you take, it's almost like the seed that was thrown into the rocky ground. It actually germinated and it was excited, but then it kind of got choked out by all the non-nourishing things that were around it.
right.
And that's the one where you can get a taste of the things of the kingdom. You feel the change in you, and uh, and then all of a sudden, all the things that you were beforehand begin to come on top of that, and you start running and making it your own and what you want it to be.
Right.
Um, and there's been a lot of people. I've even done it in my walk with the Lord, and you end up looking like what you just said. Sometimes you can take the righteous things and go out and you're trying to make the kingdom come around and transpire.
Right.
But the other one is when you take that and pervert it and it sounds good and looks good and it's almost like you're kind of sincere on one hand and on the other hand you want to make it what you want.
Right.
And so that's kind of, I'll say that it's satanic, not in the sense that it's this outward evil that's coming in. It's taking good, truthful stuff and you're twisting it to make it how you want it to be because it brings light to you and it brings.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, in one of the I was telling I'm going to do a shameless plug for this book that I've been reading. It's called The Tale of Three Kings by Gene Edwards. And if you do Audible or whatever, I actually think the Audible version is really really good. Um, but it talks about how King David, or not before David was even king, Shepherd Boy David, through King David, how he dealt with Saul, who was a crazy person. And in the book, he talks about he was a man. He was a man who threw spears. And if you remember the story, there's this one kind of, I guess, this is famous story, well known, where he throws a spear at David, it sticks in the wall. And inclination is, this dude's nuts. What do? You jank it out of the wall and you throw it back at him. Well, you don't do that to the king because the king has the
Yeah.
right to throw the spears. And this book talks about, what do you do in situations where you've got something like that? In his case, it was a madman, but the analogy is made of, leadership in your church, even in false
Yeah.
teaching, and not to say that you don't protect false teaching. I mean, it's not. He's not saying in here, don't worry about it. It's going to happen. Don't worry about it. Let it go. And it's not that you don't address it, but don't freak out about it.
Yeah. And I think that's what Peter's talking about a lot in chapter 2 and in the start of chapter 3. The false prophets and the false teachers, they're going to come. That's what he's saying. This stuff is going to come.
Yeah.
And you need to recognize the fact that when you see it, it can be sad or it can make you mad. But don't start falling off the wagon thinking that all is gone and life is over. And
Well, and it's even that you hear people do this all the time. And I was talking with somebody about this week, is because a false teacher came in, and there's a bunch of them out there. I mean, good grief, there's a ton of them. Get on the internet, I hope we're not. But I mean, everybody and their dog, all they got to do is get a YouTube channel and can have a, whatever. But people freak out like the presence of a false teacher, even a false teacher within a local congregation, as horrifying as that is, people get this mindset that now this thing's off the rails. God's not going to be able to do what he needed to do or wanted to do because this false teacher has arisen.
And it's not always obvious that there's a false teacher around.
Right.
That's
exactly.
That's the thing. It's just like one day it's like, something about this isn't right. That's
Right.
actually a good thing,
Yeah,
by the way, or at
discerning.
least within yourself. Yeah, that's discernment. That's the Lord rubbing on you a little bit.
Well, I remember I was telling Tim, as a youth pastor, as you start studying, when I was young, I had been a senior pastor. Oh, I'd been a senior pastor already. Then I came into, hey, Kevin Chambers, nice to have you with us today. Then I went into, did some youth work after that. And as the scriptures begin to get opened up and I begin to see things, you begin to see and discern in the leadership team that's over you, well, that's dumb, or that's silly. That's not biblical.
Let me ask you this in that same scenario. So you came from the fundamentalist, whatever background, and I remember, you were a King James thumping, this is the way it is kind of individual. And so in that same scenario you're talking about, you're leading youth and you're reading things and you start seeing
things don't mesh.
Don't mesh as in, did you ever have to fight with, wait a minute, this is the way it's supposed to be?
Oh, yeah.
Or back?
Yeah. I mean, to the point of, it was a real crisis of faith for me, because what I had been told was the word of the Lord, or the way things were supposed to be, that got turned into the way I thought things were supposed to be. And I really was in genuinely believe this was the right godly way.
That's righteous zeal.
It's righteous zeal. But when you get into the scriptures sometimes and you're confronted with the truth of the scripture and it contradicts what you've been told, it's not just a journey of, oh, let's fine tune and tweak this. For me, it was an upend of, is any of this true?
But how did you do that relative to the kids that you were ministering to?
We would talk about it together. I let them in on my journey. That's kind of been one of the things. I don't know if it's one of the things that has helped me. It's just the way God wired me. Is I've never been afraid to confront. One of the things that book talks about is the truth never fears a challenge, ever. Yeah. And I've always believed that. I didn't get it necessarily from the scriptures. I did later, but just something I've always believed.
And God's not afraid of what you bring to the table.
Exactly.
So I'm pointing all this out because I wanted that to come out to say that everything he was talking about, that's not false teachers.
No.
That's people. It's okay to be wrong and learn.
Yes. Okay. I see where you're going now. Now, let me make the contrast on the other side. So then what would be a false teacher would be somebody who knows better and teaches it anyway with an ulterior motive.
And the ulterior motive in those senses are usually me. I'm the ulterior motive.
Right.
Even though you may say, oh no, I'm bringing in the Lord, but you like it when people are looking at you and listening to you. And you settle there. That's false teaching stuff.
we're a lot of times really quick to put the label of false teacher on people because they're incorrect, because they
Or we perceive them to be
right,
incorrect.
or they hold to a different interpretation of a doctrine, or they speak in tongues and they do miracles and we don't. Fill in the blank of whatever they use instruments and we don't. They run around and laugh, whatever. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying all of those are good, bad, or ugly. That's not the point. But if you go to 2 Peter 2:3, here's the thing for me. He says the false teachers, it says they will exploit you in their greed with made up stories. Okay?
Yeah.
They're not teaching the truth. They're not even teaching the truth of the word of God as they understand it. They have ulterior motives.
Yeah.
They're
That's
making
good.
up stuff. And so I've learned in 26 plus years of being in the ministry that we need to be careful, number one, to put that label of false teacher on somebody, of heretic. I mean, I grew up in a world where if you didn't use, and I'm not joking, this is not a joke, it's not even, if you didn't preach out of the King James Bible, there were certain people in the circles that I grew up in that would label you a heretic. I mean, you
Yeah.
weren't even saved because you
Yeah.
used some, modern translation of the Bible. Well, it's one of the things that has helped me in not putting that label on people is to look back over my life and be like, I preached some stuff that wasn't right.
Yeah.
But I don't think I was a false teacher in the sense that there was no deception involved, wasn't made up stories. That doesn't mean I got everything right. And nobody does. They're just people. I mean, there are things that John MacArthur believes and says that I disagree with.
Yeah.
And he's probably one of the most respected theologians of the day. There's N.T. Wright, got his new perspective on Paul. And most of it, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe. But then there's parts that I'm like, I know he's got like uber intelligence, and I'm just like, I'm not sure I'm there.
I'm either too dumb or it's wrong or
Just
he's trying to
something-
figure it out.
Yeah, but I'm not going to label him a false teacher because I know I can
Yeah.
hear his heart in what he's teaching.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the urge that we get, I think, Tim, a lot of times is to, like we have said, to be like Abraham with Hagar and be like, I know the truth, and so I'm going to fix this. And
Well, it's almost like you think, well, I'm going to gain favor
Jason.
with God. I'm going to gain favor with God if I perpetuate the kingdom in some place
yes,
because I have the knowledge of what needs to happen. And it's almost like you can fix your spouse. I don't mean that in a bad sense, but you can help them be better than where they're at because they can't see it.
yeah,
Yeah, that's just that,
Yeah.
that's an off kilter way of doing. It's a linear way of doing things, but even
Well-
if you're sitting under people that are teaching wrong, not on purpose, everything you just said. What I'm trying to say is on the kingdom side of that, it's okay to be wrong if you're sincere. And that doesn't mean that if he teaches wrong things or you teach wrong things, even into your children, that the Lord can't take that and turn it around and make it right.
and I would even take it a step further, and I would hope that we would have people around us in our Christian community that would even come alongside us and be like, "Hey, man, that's not exactly right."
Yeah.
In a loving sense. And I've told the story over and over again of Dan Daniels. He'll never see this podcast because he doesn't watch podcasts. But of catching me after a service, standing at the back of the church with his Bible open in his hand. I always knew it was a terrible sign. I did something. I said something silly, and but it was never ever in a look how dumb you are kind of a way. Boy, you're a false teacher. It was never. It was always done couched in help me understand what you're saying here, because before he approached me, he always left the door open that he didn't have it right either. And if you know this fella, he's like the smartest guy I know. Like he's like uber super intelligent, crazy kind of intelligent kind of guy, IQ off the charts kind of thing. But he always left the back door open of maybe I'm not getting this right either. And 9 times out of 10, there was a miscommunication in something, and we, oh, that's what you meant. Oh, okay, got it. Well, that's not what you said, or something like that.
I've had those same encounters with him.
But having somebody that's willing to do that, is what helps you be on this, and it actually helps prevent you from becoming a false teacher.
Yes, it
while
does.
you're figuring it out. And the Spirit, John 16, the Spirit leads us into all truth. That's why we can trust Him. You know, to teach us those things. You're not gonna, and it's not that you're not gonna get things right. We can stand on the shoulders of 2,000 years of scholarship. That's a good thing, along with people and mentors and that kind of stuff. What this is talking about is really a little different in that. All right, how are the actual false teachers going to be dealt with? And
Yeah.
and it gets to it in verse 21. We read this right before we got on the air. He says, it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than after knowing it to turn back from the holy command delivered to them. So there's a couple things in this text, though, that the marking of a false teacher to me. Number one, they did know the truth. If you read in there,
Yeah.
they knew it.
Yes.
And then they turned from it. They turned back from the holy command. So it wasn't like they were ignorant. I heard a text I sent you this morning. I was listening to, it was Tim Mackey. I don't know if you know, he does the Bible Project, guys. If you're not familiar with the Bible Project, they got an app, they got all kinds of stuff. It's really awesome. But I was listening to their podcast, and he made a statement. Tim and I have talked about the difference between sin and transgression. And that, you've got overt rebellion, and then you've got like sins of ignorance and things like that. Just where you screw things up trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was talking about in the Hebrew, when Adam and Eve are, and I haven't searched this out. I just heard this morning, but it's an interesting thought line. That when they're described in the Hebrew before the fall, they're described with a word that is only used at 4 or 5 places else in the Torah. And when it's used to describe children, like innocence, moral innocence. And so Adam and Eve before the fall, they were moral infants, is the word he used, Tim Mackey used. Did what they did wrong? Yes, it broke all of humanity. But he characterized it as a sin of folly, of foolishness, because they were deceived, in contrast to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and everybody else who knew better and turned away and actually walked in actual rebellion. The false teachers in 2 Peter chapter 2 knew better and turned away from it. It's rebellion.
Yeah.
And
that's right.
To contrast rebellion against the authority and the commands of God against somebody who's really trying to figure it out, 2 Chronicles 16:9, their heart is perfect towards the Lord. They're trying to figure it out, and they just don't always get it right. Very different. And we always want to, we have this tendency to want to lump all those people together, brand them, and then tar and feather them.
Yeah, and it's not always that easy.
Right.
Kind of from a historical perspective, let's see if I can remember all this. So W.E.B. Du Bois.
Mm-hmm.
Dubois. I'm a redneck. So his, what do they call it when you live in tandem?
Duplex?
It's not a peer.
What?
Anyway.
Colleague?
Not really a colleague either. But at any rate, so Dubois, sorry.
It's a flourish when you say that.
And Booker T. Washington.
Contemporaries.
Contemporaries, yeah, that's what I was looking for. They weren't completely contemporaries because Dubois was younger. But they both ran in the same circle and they didn't like each other. And it's astounding because I've studied both of these men, not so much for the movement of the blacks or slavery or any of that kind of stuff, but just by watching their personalities. Booker T. Washington, he was born a slave, but he was pretty young when all that was over. But he never had much, he pursued his education and stuff by working his tail off and all those kinds of things, right? He was the blue collar guy, for lack of a better way to say it. Dubois wasn't. He was pretty well off. He was well educated. And what set him off on the black plight was he wanted to go get like a master's or a doctorate, and it was down in a Southern college. And when he went down there, that's where he, all the segregation stuff was going on. Of course, and it was real segregation. I'm not blaming the guy. I mean, I'm trying to bring a point out talking about these two guys. And so Booker T had always dealt with it in the face down in the South. It's where it was. That's where it was. But he would not let that beat him down. And he was a sincere, deep Christian kind of guy, right? And his philosophy was to overcome all this stuff. He wasn't looking at trying to be better than the white guy, so to speak. He was looking at the black guys, and he's going, look, you guys got to learn how to, I know you've been working all this time, but let's make you skilled workers. Here, I'm going to make a school, and we're going to teach you how to lay brick and do construction and, whatever else. And so that you go out and you do those things, and eventually, in his mind, the equal field would happen through skill.
Right.
Well, man's really screwed up, and so that didn't completely happen that way. Dubois went the other way. He was just ticked off. And so he wanted to go force the issue, and, you can kind of trace I'll use the militant black mind from way back then. I don't mean it that way. Don't know that I could put myself in that place. I'm just telling you how these two guys saw it. And so as the contemporaries, they were polar opposites on how they thought this issue needed to be dealt with. And they didn't like each other. Or at least Dubois is the only one that actually vocalized it that I saw or have read. Said, Booker T's completely wrong. He's an idiot. I mean, those kind of conversations that we hear today in our own circles. And so my point is that you've got these two elevated educated individuals that have two polar opposite ways to deal with what's going on in there. And my point is that in this false teacher thing, like we read here, we can look in our own society today. You have kids that were brought up in Christian backgrounds, and I know some of these, right? So this is where this is coming from. And they were brought up in what I would consider a good Christian background, not by you got to do this and do that. I'm talking about in scope of working through that kind of thing. And as they got older, they got really mad. They felt like they'd been turned on by their parents, taught wrong. And if they hadn't been taught those things, they would be farther ahead than where they are, and they got angry.
They've been oppressed by the Christian teaching.
Yeah, and they turned around and they're really beating that up, and some have said it just plain as day, and some of them have just beat around the bush because of their personalities. They're not up in your face people. And so they basically said everything that they learned and they taught was a false teaching.
Because they found one or two things that weren't right.
Well, whether it was one or two things or not, or they just completely rebelled against it. They blame their inadequacy of what they are and how they think people see them as inadequate, at least on the other side of the fence in the non-Christian world, right? And they've gotten beat up over that, and they've come out aggressive against it. I can't tell you which one of those are the right way.
Right.
I'm just saying that I would identify more with Booker T. Washington, not on the black plight, but in the fact that you have to look at yourself and improve yourself the absolute best that you can be and function out in that world. And what Peter's saying is, it doesn't matter how you go to church. It doesn't matter how you're contending with the Lord. Now, we're not talking about that. We're talking about, but you are contending. That's all the things we've been talking about right now, right? And if you're honestly contending, but maybe you're saying things wrong or teaching things wrong or something like that, what he's saying is in chapter 3, he says in verse 3, know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts and saying, where's the promise of Jesus' coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the very beginning in creation. He's saying like what the Hebrews would be saying if you're not going to follow Jesus, right? For when they maintain this line of argument, it escapes their notice by the word of God. The heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at the time was destroyed, being flooded with water. By his word and by the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire. So he's talking about a judgment, but he says in verse 8, do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that with the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. The Lord is not slow about his promises, comes to count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing for any of you to perish, but all to come to repentance. I got to do this to make the Lord come better. I've got to be this for him to see me better. I've got to do, and so he's taking all these false teachers, he's warning, but on the other hand, he's going, don't fret when you see that stuff.
It's supposed to happen.
It's
going.
It's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so he says, turn back toward the Lord.
Yeah.
Look in his face. Don't let this stuff of how I've been mistreated or these people or that or this or whatever, and what's real, what's a false teacher, what's not. You don't have to have all of that stuff. All you got to do is turn back to the Lord and look up and start dealing with him and rubbing with him, whether you're mad, sad, glad, whatever that is, and he will set your vision straight inside the mess that's going on.
Well, and even for those, in church leadership, let's say, who they're part of their function is to guard the sheep against wolves, against false teachers. That's true. But in doing that, you still have to keep your face in his face.
Yeah, and if you get all jacked up, my leaders ought to be doing this. I know this because I go through this.
Yeah. Me too.
God's going, stop.
Well, and
now, if he naturally brings that around, you get into it. And I know that's a whole different argument.
It's a whole different
to get into.
But I was telling Tim, this book, A Tale of Three Kings. You really ought to read it because it paints a beautiful story, about, and it even it's dramatized to a degree, like conversations that David had with some of his mighty men.
Yeah.
And they were irritated with David, and you can see it even in the story.
They were irritated for David.
Yes, offended for him because of the way Saul was treating him, and he didn't deserve it. And they got irritated that he wouldn't lash back. They got irritated. Why won't you do this? And in the book, he really, he really put some flesh on that about what David might have said, and why. He brings up the story of Moses and Korah. Korah raised up a rebellion against him, and he's like, what did it that Moses did to respond? He didn't do anything. He turned to the Lord, and he fell on his face with Aaron before the Lord, and let the Lord decide.
Yeah.
And that's what David did with Saul, and that's what David did with Absalom after Absalom grew up and opposed him and tried to take over the kingdom, over and over and over again. What David did was cried out to the Lord and said, if they would have the kingdom, if God would give them the kingdom, then who am I to say they can't have it?
Yeah.
Even if they're rotten, it's God's kingdom to give. And that's not to say that you don't correct false teaching. It's not, because there is instruction to do that. It's how you do it.
Don't make it your mission to go change it right.
And that's
and let the Lord leading you to do that. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Well, and it's and it was a really good thing for me. I mean, because I'm gonna be honest, I'm kind of wired that way. When you see something that's not right, you want to go fix it. You want justice. You want truth. Sometimes that has served me well when the heart was right in it and that kind of thing. And there have been times where you get in the flesh and it hasn't served well. It didn't go well. And even when the heart was right and you want truth and you pursue it, that doesn't always mean you're going to do it just right. The older I get, the more and this, I've been in the ministry for, like I said, 26 whatever years. We've been through a lot of conflict.
Yeah.
There's been a ton of it. There's been false teaching. There's been fill in the blank that's had to be dealt with. And sometimes it's been dealt with well, and sometimes it hasn't. And the longer I do this, and the more, even as just a person in the church, just as somebody who raises a family and attends a church, the more value I see in letting God deal with stuff.
Yeah.
And now if you get brought into something, somebody comes to you, I mean, that's, you do. You see it in the prophets and the scriptures. They didn't always go into the king's chambers. They did occasionally when God told them to. And a lot of times it was the king or the leader or somebody coming to the prophet and saying it, or to whoever. Just fill in the blank. I mean, it can happen to you. But I read in this text that don't freak out when it happens around you. What our culture wants to do is, oh, I got to go to another church. I'm going to
Yeah.
have to go find me the right one. Well, keep looking, because as soon as you get there, you'll screw it up.
Well, I think we have an innate. I think that's one of the messed up things about us in our fallen creation. Everybody has a divine nature of justice. We
Yeah.
crave it. We want it. And so we start thinking, it has to be like this. And we get all bent out of shape if we can't do it or it won't do it or whatever that is. That's the divine part in you.
Yeah.
I don't mean you're divine. I'm just saying that's part of the
It's
nature.
the eternity that's planted
It's
in
the
us.
eternal that's planted in us. And then some of us going, well, I got to make it my mission to do this. And you get if you find yourself all wrapped around the axle about stuff all the time and can't do this because of that, you're not looking at the God in the face.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you that. And it may be hard to go, well, how do I do that? Well, that's the first great question in a good sense. But that's what the Lord's doing with you. And that's what Peter's saying here. And kind of wrapping this thing up a little bit. We started out this whole book talking about who Peter was. He's a guy who's been drugged through the ringer, and sometimes by his own hand and sometimes just by the circumstance. And he is of age now, and he's putting this thing out. And that's why he's going. You're going to see all these things, brothers. Don't
freak out.
Don't let that throw you.
Well, I've found too, as I've gotten older, if I've got my face in God's face, He very rarely allows me and gets me wrapped around the axle about other people.
That's because you're looking at things properly when you're in that sense.
Well, and what happens is He'll wrap me around the axle about myself.
Yes.
Because
man,
when you're looking in the face of God, what does He say? This is like a mirror, and it reflects who He is. And as we are looking into Him, we can't do anything. There's a reason that people fall on their face like dead men when they encounter Him in Scripture, because all it does is expose the ridiculous, sinful darkness of our own hearts, even on the best day ever. And there's nothing you can do but get yourself wrapped around the axle about yourself and becoming like Him when you get in His face.
And that sounds kind of miserable. Don't know if you've ever been in a place where you've fallen down before the Lord, so to speak, but there has been places where I bet you've heard the word and you see how undone you are.
Yeah.
You got to keep going with that.
Yeah.
Because that's actually an awesome place to be. Because or at least for me, I see that He keeps me despite that stuff.
Well, that's an important thing to jump in on.
And that's an encouraging part.
It is an encouraging part, because what our culture has tended to do is, if you get it in a place where you're under super conviction, the word's wearing you out, you're undone. Oh, well, you just must not be saved then. And, let's get you down here and get you rededicated, and we got to get you whatever rededication means. It lost the idea that God keeps you because He is a consuming fire. He is a tempest. It is, and when we get around Him, the reason, this is going to be the worst analogy ever. I think I've used it before. I'll use a different one. But never mind. I don't even know if I can do that. But you remember the old, okay, I'm going to do it. You remember the old Raiders of the Lost Ark movie?
Yeah.
Well, when they opened the Ark and that dude's face melted off?
Oh, yeah.
That's what I think of happens to all of the crud in our lives when we get into the face of God. It is a tempest. It's like everything that's unholy and whatever cannot come into that presence. And so it just starts getting stripped off the closer we get to Him. And it can be painful, and it can be like a whirlwind, but what comes out on the other side is pure and purified and holy.
Well, that's because when you're in His presence, you are as you were built to be.
Right.
And we're not used to that feeling.
Yeah, it jacks us up.
And so our initial interpretation is I'm undone, I'm screwed up. Well, yeah, you are. But just think what you're like there when you're with Him there. And you're learning how to let go of that.
Right. And I think part of 2 Peter is, it's time to go, but I think part of what he's getting at here is even in the middle of false teachers, They're going to come in. They're going to wear you out. Yes, they have bad motives. It's going to be bad for them when God gets a hold of them. But don't panic.
And don't
Because
worry
God's
about
keeping
what's
you.
going to happen to them either.
Yeah. Yeah, you worry about what's happening to you.
Yes.
And I will tell you, this is at 40, I turned 47. Is that right? Yeah, 47 last Sunday. In the last 3 to 5 years, this is really just starting to take hold.
Yep.
And I've been
I
doing
get you.
ministry for 26 years.
I understand
It's
that.
just starting to take hold. And I will be as honest as I can with anybody out there. There are days where I lose that hold.
Oh yeah.
Where I want everything to be right.
Yeah.
And feel responsible to go move it along. That doesn't mean you don't stand for truth. It doesn't mean you don't. It doesn't mean all those things. I mean, there are times where those things have to happen, but it's leaving the results to the Lord.
Yes.
It's following the Spirit.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. There's still work to be done. We still move on. You know, everybody's panicking about the economy. Everybody's panicking about what's going on. All the gas prices are ridiculous. Are there practical things that could stop it? Probably. Does it irritate me? Absolutely. Every time I put my gas pump in my truck, I get angry. But that doesn't mean God's going to stop providing for us. It doesn't mean that the world is, off the rails in terms of what He wants for it.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, if He wants to destroy something, it's His to destroy.
It is.
And we spend a lot of time trying to fight, and Paul talks about, boxing against the wind, and against nothing. And it's not ours to do. And I get that out of 2 Peter, especially chapter 2. He's like, yeah, these guys are rotten and they're ugly, and it's going to be awful for them. Stay the course.
He says it's going to be rotten for them.
For them, yeah.
Not you. It may feel like it is, but it's not.
Well, and I think there's an implied encouragement. I mean, it's in other places in Scripture, but even in here, you don't have to be set off kilter by a false teacher.
Yeah.
How do you know which ones are false teachers? You get in this book right here and you let the Holy Spirit teach you. That's why it's good to know the real thing. So when the false one shows up, you know what it is.
Yeah.
What else you got?
Yeah.
Hello, Crystal McGee. Welcome to the broadcast.
Well, I thought of some other stuff, but we need to close this.
We do need to close. Everybody's going to be falling off here, but
Yeah.
we'll take notes and bring it up next week. We'll be back next week, Lord willing, finishing up or working back on 2 Peter chapter 3. Ministry wise, we are making a headlong push into getting our app put together. I've been working on that quite a bit for distribution down in Mexico. We're hoping to go back into the valley in the fall. Those details aren't together yet. But Tim, I'm itching to go back to Nicaragua real bad. So,
yeah,
we might actually put together a trip maybe next year or something. So if we do, we'll let you know about it. But as always, if you feel like you could support the ministry and would prayerfully want to do that, then 100% of that goes into the ministry, into training people. I am looking at, I don't know if I told you this or not, we're looking at having another local how to study the Bible, or our training course.
Oh yeah.
To doing it locally. I've had a couple people ask me about it, so we may just do one, see who shows up. So keep watching the channel, hit us on Facebook, and
try to give you about a month's warning.
yeah, we'll give you a little warning on that and keep it rolling. But we're glad you're here today. Like something, share something. If you're on YouTube, do some subscribe and hit that bell and all that jazz. I don't even know what all you're supposed to do, but just hit buttons until stuff starts happening. All right, we'll see y'all later. Talk to you later.